What do Turkey's recent elections mean for the country, the region, and the world? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Amberin Zaman. Amberin Zaman is a senior correspondent for Al Monitor, where she examines the politics of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. She served as the Economist Turkey correspondent between 1999 and 2016, and has worked as a columnist for several Turkish language outlets. Amberin Zaman, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you for having me, Mouin.
Turkey's presidential and parliamentary elections last month were widely viewed as the most substantial challenge to Recep Tayyip Erdogan since his rise to power 2 decades ago, particularly after he failed to secure an absolute majority during the first round of voting. Yet, against the expectations of many, he secured yet another term as a country's leader. As you know, the elections have been characterized as free but not fair. Do you agree with this assessment? And if so, can you elaborate on how this works in practice?
Well, this free and fair characterization, bothers me a bit because
well, free and not fair was the characterization.
Well, no, I understand that, but just to reduce it to that, and that's what the OSCE observer mission concluded, was that pretty much the elections were free but kind of unfair. Mm-hmm. I would argue that they're not even free particularly, because there's quite a bit of voter suppression that went on, intimidation of voters, particularly in rural areas. We heard of instances where government-aligned militias, for example, in the southeast of the country were putting pressure on villagers to vote one way or the other. All kinds of strong arm tactics that were in play in places that, were very remote and therefore probably not ones where you had international observers. And there was suppression, intimidation of the observers, of the local observers themselves. But when it comes to the unfair part, massively unfair, because the system is totally rigged in Erdogan's favor. And, he's designed this whole system, and very systematically over the years, the build up to one-man rule through this rather controversial referendum that was held in 2017, where already there were reports of malfeasance, of violations, fraud.
This was the referendum to establish a presidential system in Turkey?
That's correct, yes. And in the aftermath, you've seen all kinds of tweaking of legislation or introduction of new measures that sort of consolidate the regime. And I can cite, for example, pressure on the media as one of the most obvious examples of that. The fact that you already had media capture even before that referendum, where the president's cronies, businessmen around him in his coterie, are given lucrative contracts. And they were then pretty much told that they had to hoover up by the mainstream media outlets, which in turn became mouthpieces for the government. And it's not just newspapers, obviously. The most powerful tool for government propaganda is TV. A lot of people watch TV in Turkey. And so you had this massive propaganda machine already in place that was spinning lies, basically. So you have had a situation where in the campaign, for example, the government was claiming that the main opposition leader who ran as the opposition candidate was in league with the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is this Kurdish group that's been fighting in Turkey at the PKK, and superimposing images of the opposition candidate on images of these guerrilla leaders in Iraqi Kurdistan, and claiming that they were doing business together, that they'd even met, which is a blatant lie. But the propaganda was apparently so convincing that, for example, I would watch street interviews where people when asked who's responsible for inflation in Turkey, who's responsible for the collapse of the lira, they'd all say, oh, it's the opposition, when in fact the opposition has not been in power for the past 2 decades. So it's just mind-blowing how effective this propaganda machine has been. At the same time, of course, the government has pretty much full control of the judiciary. It's fully politicized and weaponized against all of the government's critics and foes. So again, you're saying, for example, the man I'd say who's the most talented, and many would agree with me, politician in Turkey today, the former leader of the pro-Kurdish People's Democracy Party, is in jail along with many other.
Selahattin Demirtas.
Selahattin Demirtas.
Yeah.
And you know that, in fact, many still say that the mayor of Istanbul, who in effect defeated Erdogan 3 times, first when he became a mayor of this district in Istanbul, which was under the government's AKP's control, and then when he won the Istanbul election, and then the rerun. And, you know,
He was barred from contesting the election, if I'm mistaken.
There's this court case against him, and he was convicted over some ridiculous comment that he made about the Supreme Electoral Board and the way it had handled the whole Istanbul election, you know, because the runoff took place on the grounds, or rather the redo took place on the grounds that somehow fraud was involved, which was rubbish, of course. They just hoped that they could have another election and win it this time. They didn't. In any case, yes, so he very quickly, sensing that this is the man who could be his most serious rival, quickly erected legal obstacles to him being able to run. And, you know, I could cite you countless other examples. One of the striking ones being that Erdogan had over 30 hours of airtime on Turkish TV, while his opponent had only 30 minutes. But the list is very long. It's a very grim picture from a human rights standpoint. So massively, massively unfair, yes, but just enough of a veneer of legitimacy to allow him to say, look, you know, there
was an election and I won.
Yeah. But then there's another side to all of that, which we can perhaps go into later.
Yeah, but, you know, as you've been explaining, Erdogan's ability and determination to instrumentalize the state and its institutions to his advantage is hardly a secret, and it's common knowledge. So against this background, how do you explain the widespread speculation that he would be voted out of office last month? Were such predictions the product of ignorance or wishful thinking, or did his opponents indeed have a realistic opportunity to unseat him on account of his economic policies and the mismanagement and corruption exposed by the devastating February earthquake?
Well, anyone looking at Turkey today, the devastating earthquake and the government's very, very sort of bungled response to it, and the fact that also we know that quite a few of those buildings were constructed during the AKP's reign, and probably some, God knows how many, by these crooked contractors with good, you know, close ties to the government. At the same time, the economy is in free fall. You've seen the Turkish lira shed, I mean, 40% of its value last year, and this year alone, it's now 20%, they say, since January. At the same time, of course, the government is very, very corrupt, and this has been exposed numerous times. And you would think that after 20 years, people would vote for change. There was this, you know, a pool of young first-time voters who the opposition were obviously counting on. And so I think it was a reasonable expectation that despite the fact that Erdogan had tilted the system so firmly in his favor, there could be change. But I think the problem is, first of all, the opposition made several mistakes. They went with the wrong candidate. I don't think that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, however decent a guy he is and all of that, honest, etc., could ever, hope to defeat someone like Erdogan, even today, despite being, he's visibly not in good health. He's not that old. He's actually 69, but it's kind of stooped. He has trouble walking, etc. Yet, the minute he opens his mouth, he electrifies the crowds. He's an amazing orator. I mean, I've been in his presence when he's spoken and found myself sort of carried away by him. So the choice of the candidate, and also, I mean, all of the reliable polls showed him being the least likely to win against Erdogan. And there were three main contenders: the mayor of Ankara, the mayor of Istanbul, and Kılıçdaroğlu. Yet he insisted on being the candidate. And of course, this created a rift in his alliance of six parties that was called the Table of Six, as you know. And we saw an inflection point when the second largest party in that alliance, the right-wing Good Party leader, walk away from the table, protesting at the way the selection of the candidate had played out, where she said this was an imposition, there was no consensus involved, and that she wasn't having it, only to come back 3 days later and sort of bow her head and go with it. So we already had the candidate issue. But equally, I think the way they ran their campaign was also flawed. First of all, I think there was a lot of smugness, the complacency, where they thought that,
thought it was in the bag.
They thought it was in the bag. And I think they have their own echo chamber, which, it seems to be really out of touch with the country in many ways. People ascribe their own reason, their own thinking, their own cultural codes to, Erdogan's base, when in fact, there's a very huge gap there. And Erdogan, of course, was very successful at sort of mobilizing people's fears, exploiting people's fears, especially when it came to the Kurdish issue. But if you'd like me to stop, I can, and maybe you have a different question.
Well, I would like to continue on the subject of the opposition and the opposition candidate we've just been discussing. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu of the Republican People's Party, CHP, ran a particularly chauvinistic and xenophobic campaign, especially during the second round of the elections. For example, he repeatedly pledged to collectively expel Syrian refugees from the country and vastly inflated their numbers in doing so. Do such positions account for his comparatively strong showing, or do they help explain his defeat on account of reduced turnout by Kurdish and other voters who voted for him in the first round, more out of opposition to Erdogan than support for Kılıçdaroğlu?
I would take issue with your characterization of his campaign as being xenophobic. It wasn't that at all. In the run-up to the first round, he sort of portrayed himself as a kind of a statesman, an avuncular figure who could, bring the nation together, sort of put the country back on a path of normalization, of reason, of, sort of ending these sort of polarizing sort of, hate-filled debates that's sort of the trademark of Erdogan, where he criminalizes people, like, of course, the Kurdish movement, for starters. So I think what happened in the second round was really an act of desperation. He felt the opposition apparently calculated that the only way they could sort of perhaps prevail is if they were able to win this 5% of the votes that this third candidate had won on the back of his anti-refugee comments, xenophobia, this guy who was allied with yet another xenophobe, but then the two xenophobes sort of parted ways, with one declaring his backing for Erdogan and the other for Kılıçdaroğlu.
And then it became a bidding war of sorts between Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu, no?
Yeah, except that, what Kılıçdaroğlu did to himself ultimately, and it wasn't pretty. It was, I think, very humiliating and dishonorable, really, was where he completely was at odds with the image that he'd portrayed of himself throughout the campaign of being someone decent, civil, humane, and embracing this rhetoric in the hope that somehow he could win the election. And of course, one of the things I should have said about the opposition is, rather than create their own vision, put forth their own program, their own discourse, they ended up sort of trying to be another kind of version of Erdogan. And of course, one of the problems is that in this new presidential system, you have to get 50+1 of the vote to win. And there's no other figure in Turkish politics that comes close to that in any of the polls. And of course, you needed to then have this diverse group of parties with different ideologies supporting this one guy, and this one guy having to appeal to their different constituencies. And what you ended up with was like a pretty stale fruit salad. It was just not clear what their message, what their vision was. And all the while, of course, telling the Kurds to back them without ever allowing the Kurds to be part of them and holding them at arm's length. So the whole thing was kind of already quite, I would say, fuzzy and ill-conceived.
Then how do you account for the reduced turnout for the opposition candidate?
Well, I would say, first of all, and this is what the jailed leader said, is the Kurds made a fundamental mistake. They should have fielded their own candidate to begin with for several reasons. First of all, it would have mobilized the base. It would have, appealed to their desire to have their own man there saying, the things they really want to hear, rather than have some other person, expect them to vote for them without saying anything remotely close to what they want to hear about language rights and other issues that are dear to their heart. At the same time, it would have insulated the main opposition candidate from all of this framing of him as a terrorist supporter, because his alliance with the HDP, informal alliance, allowed Erdogan,
Kurdish,
to say that, look at this guy, see, he's in league with the terrorists. And he had a full month to say that. Whereas if the HDP had fielded its own candidate, it would have gone obviously to a second round, but that would have given Erdogan just 2 weeks to sort of put forth that discourse, while allowing the party to turn to the base and say, look, guys, we tried, and we didn't win, obviously, and now we have to make sure that Erdogan doesn't win. And I think you would have seen a lot more enthusiasm and possibly no need for Kılıçdaroğlu to ally himself with the xenophobe. By the same token, as if he didn't have to worry about what the Kurds were thinking of his messages during the first round, perhaps he could have struck a slightly more nationalist tone, if you will. So, yeah.
But you seem to conclude that the opposition did have a very real possibility of winning this election and essentially ended up scoring an own goal.
I think so, yes. I think they did have a chance. I wouldn't say it was a strong chance, but they had a chance and they missed it. They missed it.
Well, turning now to the post-election period, last week, as you know, Erdogan appointed a new cabinet that is largely technocratic in nature and seems designed to reassure domestic and foreign skeptics, as well as the markets, about Ankara's current policy priorities. In a recent article, however, you've suggested this cabinet should be seen as, to use your words, window dressing aimed at tiding over Erdogan until the municipal elections, which are going to be held early next year. What are the main policies that have in recent years produced the skepticism, and why do you expect that these policies will continue?
For Erdogan, it's all about survival. So he will do anything he believes that will ensure that he can remain in power. His goal now is to win the local elections that will be held in March. And of course, he desperately wants Istanbul back, because Istanbul is key to sustaining him and his party, because that's where all the money is. That's where, the whole, rent mechanism is centered, contracts, all of that,
And it was key to his political ascent as well.
Oh, completely, yes. I mean, it's like almost a different country. It's like 18 million people live in Istanbul. It's huge. So I think he's figured out that, first of all, the economy is in very poor shape, and that he somehow needs to restore investor confidence. And so in order to do that, he needs to put in place figures who can signal a shift towards more orthodoxy. So he, I think, coerced, I don't believe the guy went there like very enthusiastically, Mehmet Şimşek, the former economy minister, who was kicked out basically for pushing back against Erdogan's, intervention in the economy. And of course, the most frequently cited example of that is the fact that he keeps insisting on keeping interest rates down, and that he's gone through 5 different central bank governors already. Technocrats. So he's got various other people, like the new vice president is also a technocrat, also has a background in economics. And then various others. Obviously, you've seen the spy boss, the spy chief, Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, and his spokesman becoming the new spy chief. And
his son-in-law is not in the cabinet,
his son-in-law is
been widely expected.
Cabinet. But, and we had a piece of kind of good news yesterday when 4 human rights defenders were acquitted of ridiculous charges of being associated with the coup attempt. And
this was by the European Court of Human Rights.
No, the European Court of Human Rights had ruled already that their detention and their convictions were unlawful and violated the European, Charter on Human Rights, to which Turkey is a signatory of.
And now Turkish courts have affected.
Turkey is bound by the European Court rulings of its own volition, but has yet consistently sort of shrugged them off, as it's done with Osman Kavala, the famous philanthropist, businessman who was in jail, and Selahattin Demirtas, for example. So the fact that yesterday the court sort of fell in line with the European Court offered people hope, and there was quite a bit of optimism that was washing over people. And I felt that this was so ironic that people are left with hoping that the very same government that's made things so awful is going to be the agent for positive change again.
Hence your reference to window dressing.
Well, so but there are several key, I think, benchmarks here. On the economy, of course, obviously interest rates. Will those interest rates go up when the central bank holds its policy meeting on June 22nd? Will Osman Kavala be freed? Will Selahattin Demirtas be freed? Will the charges against the Istanbul mayor be dropped? If I'm sitting in Washington, I'm asking myself, will the employee of the US consulate in Istanbul, who's in jail over his alleged involvement in the coup? Will he be set free? What will happen with Russia sanctions? Will Turkey stop becoming a sort of facilitator for Russia, which it in effect is, in helping it skirt sanctions? All of these questions remain unanswered for now. It's obviously still too early to say, but clearly the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And I have to say that I remain skeptical as to how far he can go, how far he can make that kind of change.
Because of these narrow political considerations that you've identified.
Well, it's, unknown to most of us the extent to which some of these policies, especially the security-related issues, are solely of his own making, or whether there's a security establishment there that he's also taking his cues from. That remains kind of opaque. And it's often suggested that his alliance with Devlet Bahçeli, the leader of the far-right nationalist movement party, is actually cover for that kind of state apparatus that sort of imposes, perhaps would be too strong a term, but whispers in his ear, and that Bahçeli is the face of it.
And was in previous eras kind of the supreme authority in the land, no?
Well, yeah, that was the military, but he's changed that balance.
Yeah.
Obviously, the military is in a very different place today. It's, first of all, a much smaller one. We often hear of how it's NATO's second largest army. The last figure I heard, it's around 300,000, and it's much more of a professional army now than what used to be, and the terms of conscription have shrunk, and etc. They're kind of big changes that have gone unrecorded, really, and that's something I should be reporting on in the military. And now, of course, we are seeing a new trend emerge where the Chief of General Staff goes on to become the Minister of Defense, which is quite interesting. So given all of that, and this new balance, it's hard to, for example, for me to think that there'll be any kind of change on the Kurdish issue, for example.
Which we'll get to in a moment.
Sure.
But
sure.
Your comments about the security establishment notwithstanding, if Erdogan is unrestrained by either government or parliament, what are the main constituencies supporting his autocratic rule, and how would you define his domestic agenda?
Okay, so going back to your original question about free and fair and all of that, I don't think it was unfair enough to be able to call it like a fake election like you have in Turkmenistan or Russia, those kinds of countries. Not at all. In fact, I would say that, if anything, this election has shown us all again that he does have a solid constituency. He still has popular backing. I mean, it speaks obviously to the ineptitude of the opposition, but equally to his own resilience as someone who's able to still move the crowds. And I think he's been really effective at weaponizing fear, paranoia, culture wars, all of that, identity politics. He's the real master of it. And, people go on about how, this election has been a big win for Turkish nationalism. And Turkish nationalism has always been part of the fabric of this society, certainly in late Ottoman times and in the early days of the Republic, and thereafter, especially all this sort of anti-Western sentiments that derive from, the sort of Sevres Treaty, this idea that they're out to get us, they're out to divide Turkey, break it up, etc. That's always been around. But What Erdogan has done, though, very effectively, I think, is to reinvigorate and shape that nationalism to his own benefit by creating these new myths through, he's been very good, for example, at using TV for that. All these TV series that, about the Ottomans, and just allowing people to, think that they're reclaiming that glory, that Turkey under Erdogan is able to sort of find its real place in the world, the place that it deserves in the world. Just all of that, I think, is mistaken as just nationalism. When I always like to remind people that in 2015, when you had the peace process still ongoing between the Turks and the Kurds, where was the nationalism? That was when you still, a lot of it had gone away, but still some shred of hope, just by virtue of those peace talks continuing, that Turkey was still on some kind of a democratic path. And that allowed Selahattin Demirtas to win 13% of the vote.
But if we look at his constituencies and those who have kept him in power, you've now indicated for us what some of the main sources of his popular appeal in Turkey. But who should we be looking at? Is it the business elites? Is it who are his core constituencies that he relies upon to remain?
I think that, well, obviously, I hate to be reductionist, but you look at the map, and of course, it's central Anatolia.
Mm-hmm.
The red provinces are all the opposition ones, and they're mainly in the southeast, the Kurds, and then in the coastal cities, it's the CHP and the other opposition parties. It's the, pious, conservative, stroke nationalist, I'd say lower, the poor, obviously, but also lower middle class, some, and when it comes to the business elite, obviously his own nomenclatura would clearly be voting for him, but I don't think their size it can even begin to compare with the others the other constituents that I described, and that's his core. And it's astonishing to many people that he was able to convince the victims of the earthquake that he was best placed to make things better for them. And one stunning statistic is where the one where people say that the economy has gotten a lot worse under Erdogan, yet that he is better placed than the opposition to fix it. So, yeah. And I think, of
I
course,
alone can fix it, as a politician elsewhere once said.
Yeah, but he's also, I forgot to mention religion. He's been very good at sort of fusing that with the nationalism.
Mm-hmm. And how would you define his domestic agenda? What are its key objectives? What are its key components?
Well, his own survival to start with, but I think it's also a civilizational project for him. He's looking at his legacy, and he wants a Turkey that's, much more assertive for one, and it has become a much more assertive Turkey. He wants Turkey to have its place at the table on equal terms with other world powers, which is why he keeps banging on about the world is bigger than five, which refers to the Security Council at the United Nations, which he thinks should be expanded to include countries like Turkey. He wants it to be more than a regional power. He wants it to be a global power, and he fancies himself as some kind of leader of the Turkic world, but of the broader Islamic Ummah. And of course, what are the markers of that? Well, just look at where he held his last campaign speech, the Hagia Sophia. Mm-hmm. It's very symbolic, which he transformed into a full-service mosque. Mm-hmm. That's a huge symbolism, and I think that however much he's done a U-turn on Sisi and others in the region, and now Assad, still for many Muslims, he's somebody that they kind of revere still, because he speaks up for them as they see things.
So if we look at his domestic agenda, should we compare him, for example, to the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood in some of the surrounding countries?
Well, he's a lot better at it than they were, let's face it. You know, they do have quite a bit in common in terms of their ideology. But as Eric Edelman, a former American ambassador to Ankara, noted, this was revealed in the Cables Leak. I don't recall the exact wording, but he said that if he had to choose between himself and Allah, he would choose himself. That, his own interests rise above all else. So to sort of define him in ideological terms, I think would be highly misleading. I don't doubt.
Well, it's not so much in
piety, but I think he's hugely pragmatic. Yes, of course, as a young man, he was very much shaped. I mean, he came out of the Islamic movement by anti-Western, ideas, anti-secular, and he's made many statements that, overtly reveal his contempt for the secularists and how he believes that religion should have precedence over all else almost. Yet in the same breath, he speaks about democracy, of course. But note that he speaks a lot about democracy. I've rarely heard him use the term human rights. I was listening to his latest speech. Again, it was democracy, yeah, but what about human rights? Somehow the Quran is a better or far superior, I guess, document to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in his world.
In promoting his agenda.
But I mean, he's infinitely pragmatic. So don't forget that trumps all ideology for Erdogan.
Yeah, I wasn't so much trying to characterize his ideology as more his agenda, but now turning to a key domestic challenge with negotiations between Ankara and the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, no longer really on the agenda. The Kurdish question, nevertheless, remains as perhaps the most important domestic challenge confronting Turkey. Given how you've characterized the situation and Erdogan, how do you expect this issue to develop during his new term?
Well, I just want to say one last thing on the agenda. He's pretty much, accomplished everything he wanted to. He's installed the system that he wanted to. The military is fully, pretty much, as far as we can see, under his control for now. So, I guess the next agenda item really is the succession and ensuring that there is a smooth succession, and ideally somebody from his own family. I keep predicting that he's looking at his younger son-in-law, who's married to his favorite child, his younger daughter, the brains behind the drone program, Selçuk Bayraktar. That's who I think it is. But to turn to your question, on the Kurds, I don't see that there's any chance of a return to those negotiations anymore. That's in the past. We're not going back there, and he's
Why is that?
Well, because he doesn't need to.
Mm-hmm.
He can win elections without the Kurds, as we just saw. And as for the mayoral elections, the opposition now is in such disarray that the idea that they can stitch back together that coalition that was in place before the mayoral polls in 2019 and subsequently before this last election is, it's a very remote chance in my view. And the Kurdish party itself is kind of in disarray at the moment, going through a major, a bout of self-questioning and sort of trying to find a new way forward. And Erdogan feels that his current tactics of basically using brute force, military force, and suppressing the movement domestically, the political side of it, the political wing, while at the same time putting maximum pressure on the military, the PKK, has proved quite effective. I mean, however much the PKK declared a unilateral ceasefire as an act of compassion, of,
It was ignored by the state.
Well, not only was it ignored, but many would argue that it was just making a virtue out of necessity, because they're squarely on the defensive. These Turkish drones in particular are really making life very hard for them. They cannot move freely anymore. And the air campaign, is consistent, unremitting. And they keep getting some, all the people who are supposed to be the future generation of leaders are getting killed one by one. And not just in Iraqi Kurdistan, but also in northeast Syria. The same thing is happening, while Turkey is also at the same time chipping away at the self-administration, the Kurdish-led self-administration that's in place there, doing its best to make it sort of crumble.
In Syria.
That's and at the same time, we saw this alliance that Erdogan formed with this party called Hüdapar, which is this extreme radical religious Kurdish group that sprung out of a Turkish version of Hezbollah, nothing to do with the Lebanese namesake, that was very violent in the 1990s and it was basically targeting the PKK inside southeast Turkey. And then, kind of like Jolani did in Idlib with HDS, they've put on suits now and they claim to be peaceful and all of that. And Erdogan is sort of using them to win over, because let's not forget, Turkish Kurdistan, the southeast of the country, is the most, I would say, religiously conservative parts of the country, and trying to sort of get the support of the religious conservative Kurds that he kind of lost in recent years, and to win them back, while at the same time totally sidelining the Öcalan-led Kurdish movement, pressurizing it, criminalizing it, and at the same time escalating the military campaign against the PKK and keeping it squarely on the defensive.
And just to return once again to the question of refugees, Turkey, of course, hosts very large numbers of refugees, primarily Syrians, but has also emerged as an important conduit for others, Afghans, Iranians, and others seeking to reach Europe, and has done this dirty deal with the European Union to keep them from crossing into the EU. How do you see this issue developing?
Well, the campaign showed us and showed Erdogan and every other politician in Turkey that this issue of refugees is a very big one in Turkey. There's a huge amount of resentment felt towards them and their violent racist attacks against Syrians. And while Erdogan has sort of framed the issue in, I would say, more humane language than the opposition did in the last days of the campaign, basically saying we're going to kick them out as soon as possible, like yesterday. He is very conscious that this matters and will matter even more as the economy continues to deteriorate. So what he's hoping, I'm not sure I find it particularly realistic, but it does serve one of his agendas, is with Qatari money, some Gulf money, to send back those refugees to areas that he wrested from the Kurdish-led administration there. So in effect, executing demographic change inside Syria along
territorial
Turkey's
conquest.
Yes, and I find that extremely disturbing, dangerous, and not quite sure how anyone can push back against that, because as we've seen, US engagement in particular in Syria, it has just been diminishing over the years. It's just not a big issue anymore in the United States. And the fact that the war against the Islamic State was, well, the territory, the caliphate collapsed. That was back in 2019. And of course, at the time, the Kurds were riding very high in world public opinion. But things have, the world has moved on. You've now got Ukraine, you've got the China issue. So I don't see how there can be that much pushback when, especially as you mentioned, the Europeans, are absolutely desperate to keep these people out of their own borders. So if Turkey chooses to push them, back to Syria, so be it. They may make a few noises about it, but will that translate into sanctions against Turkey or what? The Europeans have lost quite a bit of leverage. I mean, they basically lost
That's
it.
assuming they were ever prepared to use it. Well,
because from the get-go, I mean, they said that Turkey couldn't become a member just within minutes of saying they were starting full membership talks with Turkey. I think that was like a big moment, in terms of assessing how things could get as bad as they have. Mm-hmm. It gave Erdogan that much more, room to indulge his worst instincts. Mm-hmm. Whereas if there had been a real path towards membership, I very much doubt that things could be where they are today in Turkey.
And on this issue, Turkey's place in the world, my final issue I'd like to discuss with you today.
Of course.
Turkey has, as you know, achieved growing regional and international prominence in recent years, particularly in the context of the Arab upheaval, conflict in the South Caucasus, the European Union issue we just mentioned, and now, of course, also the war in Ukraine. How would you define Erdogan's foreign policy agenda and its objectives?
Well, I mean, for much of the early days of the Republic and throughout the Cold War, I mean, Turkey was, maintaining the status quo, one of sort of preserving what they had left over from, the Ottoman Empire, mm-hmm. and was much more inward looking. And of course, during the Cold War, obviously perceived the Soviet Union as the number one threat, and therefore was, by and large, I would say, had that pro-Western, but pretty much inward-looking orientation. Of course, you had the Cyprus incident when it went and invaded northern Cyprus, but setting that aside,
1974, I believe.
Yeah, 1974. I think up until the invasion of Iraq, things were kind of pretty much stable on the foreign policy front. Yes, you had anti-resentment of the Americans and all that, but, by and large, Turkey was very happy to be part of NATO and, to go along pretty much with the West on the big security issues, the big...
And in 2003, of course, the Turkish parliament...
and the invasion of Iraq, I think, and even before the invasion already, when the United States set up that no-fly zone over Iraqi Kurdistan, Turkish paranoia was sharpened about, the West wants to build a Kurdish state and eventually they'll take out chunks from Turkey, etc. But that was further sharpened, obviously, by the invasion and its aftermath, where you saw this Kurdish entity gain formal recognition in the Iraqi.
This is a Kurdish regional government in Iraq.
Could keep that in check was to establish over that entity, which it has, by becoming the sole exporter of its oil, which is the main source of income. At least that's what pays government salaries in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is why the Iraqi Kurdish government is so aligned with Turkey on so many issues, and in particular on the PKK. What kind of foreign policy? Well, it's a much more revisionist one now, one where Turkey is flexing its muscles, and as I mentioned previously, trying to, you know, wrest that place that it feels it deserves, looking out for its own interests primarily above, you know, its alliance commitments, but quite happy, obviously, to leverage its role in NATO to win concessions from Russia and vice versa. And above and beyond all else, obviously, Turkey's geographic location is such that it will always be a very critical country, as it currently is in this Ukraine conflict, by virtue of, first of all, being the conduit, the main export route for Ukrainian grain, which is helping people stay alive in Africa.
And is able to instrumentalize its position to extract benefits from all the various protagonists.
Yes, he's very clever, very good at leveraging. And this, we've seen that the very substantial effects of this more assertive policy, for example, in Azerbaijan, in the conflict in 2020, when Azerbaijan took back all those territories that had been occupied by Armenia in a previous war, together with parts of the contested enclave Nagorno-Karabakh. And that was thanks to Turkey's military intervention, and also partly that of Israel. We've seen it help sustain the government in the internationally recognized government in Libya, again, through its military intervention. And, you know, when you had that bust up within the GCC, was it 2017, 2018?
Yes, and Turkey was Qatar's main ally and lifeline initially.
Absolutely. And you see Turkey becoming increasingly assertive, active in France's traditional sort of, as it would consider it, backyard in North Africa, along in West Africa, and also in East Africa, the Horn of Africa. In the Balkans, Turkey is extremely influential. And through its diaspora inside Europe itself, it can flex its muscles. And it's very surprising almost to me to see that Europeans are almost scared of Turkey, of Erdogan. I just recently did a story about a group of Europeans who helped in a project in northeast Syria, a very great project, a very useful one, not ideological at all, but was helping locals. And they just didn't want to be identified. They said, we're terrified. If you mention our name, Erdogan will, you know, his national spy agency will come and kill us. I was like, what are you smoking? But I mean, yeah.
Amberin Zaman, I'd really like to thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I love Jadaliyya, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.